Welcome everyone. Today we're here to talk about the Forgotten School. The school in question is the Myth School. Now in this video I'm going to talk about the serious issues with Myth as well as some creative and fun suggestions of my own afterwards. I only ask that those of you watching hear everything out until the end before deciding one way or the other. Otherwise, feel free to challenge anything I say in this video in the comment section and I will try to reply to all of them. Without further ado, let's do this. So the way I chose to start off the discussion of Myth is to first identify the strengths, very briefly, of each school of magic. You know, Fire and Storm are obviously the hard hitters. Both are arguably the strongest hitter in the game. Ice has the most health and defense overall. Life has the best healing. Balance has the most buffs and the buffs for any type of school. Death is the best solo with its unique ability to drain health while attacking, as well as an all-around school with support such as Dark Pact, Fent, and Cursed, etc. So what exactly is Myth's specialty? Well, one would say utility, but I'm not quite so sure about that, and we're going to get into why. But first, let's just start out by stating the fact that Myth really has no support ability whatsoever due to the competition. One might say its strength is Shatter, but of course any school such as Life, Death, and Balance, who have much more to offer, can just carry Shatter treasure cards, whereas Myth would have to have a Life Mastery, outgoing gear, and when all is said and done, all it really has to offer from its own side is Shatter. Whereas, say, Death can carry a Life Mastery and have much more to offer like Plague, Bad Juju, Dark Pact, etc. Another card would be Earthquake, but of course it requires 6 pips. It will remove the traps of your team as well, and so that just kind of makes it out of the question, having such a high pip cost and next to no benefit because it screws your team over as well. And then that kind of leaves stuns, which kind of became useless after Celestia, as most, if not all, major bosses are stun immune. Even some sub-bosses are. And realistically, seeing as not even Myth can remove stun blocks, all of this becomes pretty weak even if you can stun them, because that's only one time that you can stun them unless you stun twice after that to remove the stun blocks. Apart from that, the only thing that I can think of is Cleanse Ward, which, if it removed all the traps off of a person, it might become viable. Not that this is a suggestion of mine, it's not, because this would be a little bit over the top, but the only way that I can ever see this being viable or usable for any Jade, for example, would be if it removed all traps off of everyone on your team. But to me that sounds a little bit ridiculous. But then again, so does carrying a spell that removes one trap off of one person. And lastly, the only way you can remove, say, your opponent's blades without treasure cards like Enfeeble is again with Earthquake. But we already addressed the problem with that. So as it stands, the only really viable tool that it has is Shatter. And, you know, especially if it's trying to support, it already has a health problem, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So now you might be thinking, well, not every school has to have a support ability, and you would be right about that. So let's talk about Myth's damage side of things. Myth right now is the 3rd hardest hitter, but before we get into raw damage, let's talk about specialty. Myth's specialty is minions, as well as tricky spells that can often get around defense, such as Minotaur hitting twice. Mystic Colossus has been changed now, removing a shield before it hits, and King Artorias has now become a one-hit spell, but it's during an overtime, so the first 2 ticks do not count. It only hits completely on the 3rd tick, giving you time to remove shields for 2 rounds or stun, or whatever you'd like to do. But the minion side of things was kind of left in the dust, which is really unfortunate, Now, I do have a suggestion on the minions, but that will be mentioned later. As it stands, Myth's minions is something that is very intertwined with the school, but they're very lackluster. At best, they have very low health, they serve random purposes, they can ruin your setup by attacking your traps, and oftentimes will just die before anything useful happens with them anyway. Not to mention that the pip cost for them is far more than it's worth, and sadly for Myth, it can only have one out at a time unless you're using Monstrology. So minioning has kind of become a lost art of the school, and it's really sad to see. But if we head back to their damage, due to the school's utility of shatters and wacky methods of hitting, it might be slightly easier for them to guarantee an unguarded, or rather an unshielded hit, but obviously it's not going to be nearly close to Storms and Fire's damage, which in retrospect is just fine. But if you were ever in a, say a dungeon with people, they will always choose Storm and Fire over Myth to hit, leaving Myth with kind of next to no support ability, as well as really only being useful as a backup hitter, with the exception of maybe if they want you to stand there waiting to use Shatter if it's needed. But say even if you are the hitter, due to the most recent buffs and nerfs to spells, Myth kind of took a nosedive in terms of being able to hit. Now, the first one I should mention is obviously now that every blade and bubble and everything is now the same, Storm and Fire are getting buffed just as equally as Myth is, but its spells are rough to say the least as well. Myth has great single attack spells, things like Witch Call, Scion, and Celestial Calendar, all doing great damage. But if we're to be honest, most bosses have minions, and typically you have to use hit-alls, and Myth's hit-alls have gone way downhill. Mystic Colossus, for example, got nerfed to 635 damage, meaning that the strongest hit-all that Myth currently has is ORTHRUS at 700 base damage, which is a big jump down considering, first of all, the stat difference, which we're going to get into next, but also that its competition of Storm and Fire. Storm has its strongest hit of a base hit of 940, that being GLOWBUG, and Fire's strongest hit-all base damage is Raging Bull with 825. Technically, Dragon is its strongest hit-all at 975, but that's of course in overtime. And Fire's damage statistics need no introduction. So how are Myth stats? Well, I won't bore you by telling you it doesn't get nearly the damage as Fire and Storm gets, because that's kind of obvious. But rather, what's surprising to me is how ridiculously low its mana is. No, of course, I'm just kidding. No one cares about mana. What I was actually going to say is how low its health is. It's not noticed by many Myths, but have you ever noticed how much lower Myth's health is than the rest of the schools? It could possibly be lower than Fire's. And I mean that. If it's not, it's kind of barely above, which is a problem considering how Myth, who has no support and has to really rely on being effective with damage, also has less health than a school that has possibly the best damage in the game, rendering Myth almost pointless to play, aside from the fun factor of it. But a big reason to why Myth's health is so low is because the gear that they give to Myth gives the exact same health as Fire. If you don't believe me, I've gathered just a few photos of the Dragoon set to compare them. I won't show you all of them, but believe me, each piece of that set gives the exact same health, meaning the only edge that Myth's health gives comes from its base health, which is practically nothing. The contrast between Storm and Fire, for example, back in the day, Storm hit convincingly higher than Fire, albeit that changed now in current times. Their health dynamic is still the same. It shows a major difference between them. Storm used to be able to hit harder at the cost of their health being lower. But Myth and Fire don't have that same dynamic for some reason. And Myth's utility has not proven worth the health drawback. So overall, Myth is in a very weird spot right now. having terrible to pretty much non-existent support, which any regular support school can just carry shatter treasure cards and make myth absolutely obsolete, as well as having 10 times greater other options as well. And its damage gets clobbered by the damaged titans. And with its health, it could never be a solo school either. So it more or less has to be on a team, but when it's on a team, it's practically useless. And last but not least, its unique factor being their minions has not lived up to expectation. So the only question now is can Myth be saved? Well, at least from my perspective, I have a couple suggestions now that I'd love to hear feedback on, and what your thoughts on the school are as well. My first suggestion, and my favorite suggestion of them all, would be that the Myth School should be able to control their own minions. Like, wouldn't that be awesome? After you casted your minion, you now have 2 sets of cards to choose from. One being your own, and your minion's set of cards, which would already make Myth better, and make minions a lot better. The second suggestion, you should be able to summon more than one minion. In fact, you should be able to build your own team. I feel like that's a huge part of what Myth's all about, and it would be awesome to say be in a very hard fight on your own, but you have 3 minions on your side doing all the things you need them to do, making your own team in battle. I feel that would just be awesome. I feel that would be a much better representation of what Myth was supposed to be about. And just to add on, the minions themselves should gain more specific purposes. Like, this minion should be really good at healing, and this minion should be better at blading, and this minion should be better at shielding, etc. Number 3, and as with all these suggestions, they can be adjusted for PvP. But Myth stuns should not cause stun block. Like, to balance it out, they could increase, say, Blinding Light to a 3-pip spell, so it can't be spammed forever. Although this won't do much to the boss, this can allow Myth to hold off the minions for several rounds, providing its own unique support, different from all the other schools, while remaining balanced. And last but not least, maybe just give it a tiny bit more of health. I'm not too worried about increasing the damage, because it's not its purpose to be a hitter, and it already has decent damage. It does pretty decent damage. But, you know, with the health increased by a bit, and with the other suggestions included, it can kind of become a complex solo school, you know, with a company of minions to heal, shield, and buff you at your wish, while you focus on the task, kind of like a true conjurer. So that would be kind of my suggestions. Thank you for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are on everything you saw here in this video below, and if you'd like me to do another one on a different subject. But as for this right now, that all being said, this presidential briefing is now over. Have a good night.